So to put it shortly, the way you practice better is to take your part that you're struggling on and isolate it instead of going all the way back to the beginning and playing through as if we were doing concert order. But besides that, there is a lot more to it than just isolate the exercise. That's just a short answer. Now for the more longer explanation, let's say we were struggling on something like articulation, rhythm on one passage. Instead of going back to the beginning and restarting all the way through, like I said before, we can instead take that passage and only play that passage and practice it to consistency. But there's an even better way to practice than just taking one part and playing it over and over again and expecting stuff to happen. That is called insanity. I think there's a better way to do this because you could take whatever you're struggling on and turn it into an exercise as compared to just playing it over and over again. For example, let's say you're struggling on rhythm, and it's like an eighth note rhythm that's fairly fast and requires some good articulation. Instead of just playing that part over and over again, we could take our instrument and take the notes from that part and just turn it into an exercise. So let's say a bunch of eighth notes descending down to the very lowest note that you have in that single measure or those few measures that you're struggling on. And that's just the beginning. That's a very simplified way of putting it, but we could take it a little bit further. So let's take that exercise that I just played for example. We're gonna instead of just playing this exercise over and over again, we could maybe try adding more elements to it. Let's say we managed to get our articulation and rhythm down. Yeah, right, correct. But then we're struggling on some other part that is maybe a bit of tone issues. Maybe you can't hit. There's a certain note that you can't hit. Instead of completely trashing that exercise and making a new one, we could take the exercise we just had and incorporate it into this next thing that we have to work on. Let's say there's a B flat, not a B flat. Let's say there's a, for example, E flat, the one with the trigger on your trombone at third position or very flat third position. We can go from our highest note and then just descend down to it, which was the exercise I was just doing it. But instead of focusing on articulation with that, we could focus on our air and our tone and our being able to hit that note. So we took this exercise that was mainly meant for articulation and rhythm, and we turned it into an exercise that we could use to help us with our tone, with our hitting of the notes. Back in my previous video, I've talked a lot about air. The very short summary of what I did in that video, or what I explained in the video, is basically you use a lot of air and you use very consistent, straight airflow and using the correct speed for the notes in which you're hitting. With that being said, we could also use that on our exercise, but then now we can add tonguing into an exercise. What I said previously, yes, it is good to make up an exercise that you can use to help you get through it, but at the same time, I think it's better we first start off with a very basic air, and you do your air exercises, you do your tone exercises, and then after that, that's when you can start incorporating your tongue into it. So when we're tonguing, we got to make sure that we're not tonguing too harshly or tonguing too lightly. Tonguing too lightly, it's quite simple. You don't tongue good enough, you don't tongue strong enough, and it ends up sounding more like a slur than a legato, which is something we do as trombone players. As for trombones, we tongue very lightly for our slurs because we have our slide when we don't have a natural slur that goes up another fundamental. But with that being said, it's good to be able to have a good tonguing. With that being said, it's still good to know how to lightly tongue on other instruments so that you could better incorporate that sound and blend it if you're in an ensemble. As for heavier tonguing, it's not good to tongue too much, but it is good to tongue strong. What I mean by too harsh of a tonguing is when you tongue too harshly and your tongue gets in the way of your airstream. So let's say here's the roof of your mouth. There's a little curve right here, right? It's a little curve with the roof of your mouth. Your tongue is slapping against the roof of your mouth, but it's like taking a little bit of time and slowly descends back down. Similar to that, but your tongue gets in the way of your air. So what this does is it drags your air down and causes your lips to either struggle to hit the note properly and enter properly, or it causes you to slow down in tempo because of the tongue getting in the way. Keeping that in mind, we could then transfer all this knowledge we have into our instrument. So when we start on our higher note, when we start on our highest note that we're going to start on, we got to make sure we enter properly and have a good strong tongue, but not too harsh, not too light, so that we can enter that note properly. And then once you're doing the same for your other notes, repeating that note, you got to make sure that it stays as consistent as possible. You want every single note to sound exactly the same. Now, this doesn't apply, this exact same thing doesn't apply to every single scenario. As much as consistency is really good to have down, you don't need to have the exact same sound with everything you play. There's many different scenarios which we play and use different methods, different sounds. But for now, we're going to work on consistency, and consistency is what we are working on. So make sure every single note sounds same pitch, same tone, same duration. That is the key. Duration especially is the key to these rhythm exercises. I think everybody has seen the demonstration or the example where you take a block and you cut it up into pieces. You don't separate out that block into multiple pieces with space in between. It's still that block, just with slices in between. We've all seen that, but it's a really good explanation, because you're keeping your air straight all the way through and just cutting up that air into different segments without separating it. You don't want separation unless, of course, you're playing staccato or with eighth notes. But even then, you still want to have that correct duration, because when you have your eighth notes, just like eighth notes in on beats, right? It's still that consistent bit of eighth note that you gotta play. So each space in between and each eighth note is the same length all the way through. Unless of course there's different articulations or the style is different, but that for now we are not gonna worry about that. We're just gonna worry about the consistency, because every note is gonna be the same length no matter what. Sorry, not every note, but every note of the same value will be the same length all the way through. Of course, not accounting for articulations or different styles. Another thing I mentioned in my previous video is that lower notes require more air to play generally. So what we're going to be doing, doing with that knowledge is that when we're tonguing down in the lower register, it's going to feel a little bit more different. Absolutely, for me, it's going to feel different because I don't necessarily double on these instruments, but I do also play the chimbasso and the contrabass trombone. So my whole mouth is messed up because I'm used to large bores and then going back down to this very strange medium bore trombone. But that's besides the point. If we're going down to the lower register, the tonguing is going to feel a little bit different. It's a little more different for the lower register. For the higher register, absolutely going to be a little bit more of a little change that you're maybe not used to or familiar with. So what we could do is maybe when we're going down to our lower notes, we got to have a much stronger tongue because we have more air to work with. We got to make sure that the separation is heard but is not too obvious. So we still have to take the same block concept where we cut up our air into multiple pieces but keep them together. But we want to make sure that we want to make sure that these spaces in between, that we can still hear them. So with that being said, our lower notes, we got to use a heavier tongue. We don't use, or a stronger tongue. We don't want to use more tongue. We want to use the same amount of tonguing with a more force to it. For example, when we're throwing a small rock, we throw it, it's gonna fly pretty far. But when we take a bigger rock and we throw it with the same strength, then it's not gonna fly as far because there's more weight behind it. So we have to compensate for that with more force. That's the same concept for our tonguing. Instead of throwing the bigger rock with a bigger hand, instead of making our hand bigger somehow and throwing it with a bigger hand, we use that same hand that we used to throw that rock and put more force behind it. I hope that makes sense. That's the best way I could describe it. Now for the opposite end of the spectrum, we have our higher notes. It's gonna feel a little bit more different. For most people, we tend to tense up a little bit when we're playing our high notes. It's not good to be tense at all. We want to be relaxed as much as possible. As my private instructor said, we want to be as lazy as possible while playing our instrument. Well, that what he was talking about was mainly trombone players. Trombone players want to be as lazy as possible. So, but we could still take that same logic, and apply it to everything else. If we're just relaxed and not all tensed up, it tends to flow more smoothly. Let's say, for example, we're getting a shot, right? If we tense up, it's more hard for the needle to pierce through the skin and get to the bloodstream because we're all tensed up. There's more muscle that the doctor has to go through. But if we relax, we're very relaxed, the needle's able to slide in a lot easier because there's not as much contracted muscle that it has to cut through. So with that, we could have a more clean sound with our higher notes, at the same time tonguing it a little bit easier. So when we're tonguing our higher notes, we want to be relaxed, we want to be stable, we want to make sure that we're not all over the place with our tonguing. So we gotta use a little lighter tongue, but at the same time it's still firm, it's still there. We want to relax, but we still want to relax as much as possible. And this applies to many different concepts with relaxing. This applies to many different concepts. Just we gotta relax, make sure we're not tense, that we're all calm and settled. If you need to, you could put your instrument down, take a breather, just relax for a second, pick your instrument back up. It's simple because it's not good to push yourself. That's one of the more important. That is one of, if not the most important thing about being a musician or an instrumentalist, at least in my opinion, is if you need to relax, if you need to calm down, you need to take a break, take that break. Calm down and relax. It's okay to not be practicing 24/7. It's good to be practicing a lot. It's not good to be practicing so much where you're stressing out about it. Back to our tonguing, we could take everything that we just learned from now and then put that into an exercise that we can make for ourselves. So for example, I'm kind of struggling on tonguing on the very high register, let's say B flat and C. So what I would do, me personally, what I would do is I would take notes below it first and then work my way up instead of starting on those notes. So I take, let's say, G. We take G and I start on that note, and then I make sure I get my tonguing consistently and start going up in half steps. If I were doing this for lower notes, I would do the same thing, but the opposite way around. I would start on higher notes and then work down to lower notes. And this is absolutely not something that's set in stone. These are not rules. It's more of a guideline, if anything. Do not think that anything that people tell you, it's not subject to change. For example, we have Rimsky-Korsakov's Trombone Concerto. There are no dynamic changes, at least with ink. I mean, unless you count this as a dynamic change, forte to forte. I don't know why that's there, but we don't go dynamic change until our fortissimo a few lines down. At least that's from what I see. But the point is that we added a crescendo here. We did not have to add this crescendo, but we did. Why? Because we don't have to follow this entire sheet as written, because, well, it's a piece of paper. It's not going to tell us what to do. It's not going to tell us what's wrong and what's right. We could take whatever we need to do and change it as we see fit and what we think would work better or would sound better to us. So to sum it up, what we learned is that we can't be holding ourselves back because we saw someone do an exercise or heard someone do an exercise and we think that we have to copy exactly the same. Make sure that you're expanding upon what you know and what you learn, and by doing anything that helps you to focus and practice on certain things. Just if someone tells you, or like a director or teacher or instructor, they tell you to do something the exact same way, then go ahead. Then they're the one who's teaching you. But at the same time, don't just think that we have to just because they said so. Sure, they told you to do it, like let's say an exercise, lip slurs, B flat F D, sorry, B flat F, B flat F trigger. Do it that way, sure, but then also make sure you do your own exercises in which you are more comfortable with, in which you feel like works for you. The second thing is consistency. I'm going to be saying this a lot during all these episodes that I'm going to be making, or these videos that I'm going to be making. Consistency is key. And then number 3, take a break when you need it, please. I've experienced this a lot, where I would practice for 3 hours straight, but I wouldn't be practicing good at all, because the last hour or 30 minutes, it was just me survival playing because I was desperate to try to get through. Take a break, please. It's not good to be survival playing. It's not good for you. It's not good for your sound. It's not good for anybody to be pushing themselves. And most importantly, number 4, just make sure to have fun. Like if you don't enjoy what you do, then it's pretty dead. It feels more dead doing it. It's more like a chore. So if you don't enjoy what you're doing, then please try to find some way to find joy in it, because, well, for a lot of people, they don't really take music, or they don't take band anywhere further than high school or middle school. For me, I want to take this as far as I can. It's a passion of mine, and if it's not something that you're interested in anymore, if you don't want to do it anymore, then that's completely okay. Just make sure that you're not quitting because you don't think you can. Just if you're gonna stop, make sure it's because you genuinely aren't interested in this anymore. But I don't want to leave too much on a really bad note, but it's just if you don't like it and you don't want to do it, don't feel pressured to stay. Don't feel obligated to stay. And for those of you who think that it's really hard and that's really difficult, yes, of course it's really hard. It's really difficult. We're doing 5 things at the same time, while sounding like we're only doing 1 thing at a time. We're thinking about our sound. We're breathing. We're looking at music. We're playing music. We're blowing air. And that's just 5 things. There's many more things that we have to consider. But if you're struggling, make sure number 1, that you're not forcing yourself to get good. Make sure that you're getting good because you want to be good. And with that, thank you for watching all the way through. I'm getting a little better. I'm getting a little better at making these videos, so thank you for sticking through. I'll see you next time.